It's time to talk hockey with the Utah Mammoth and NHL Insider on KSLSports.com. Cole Bagley on 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone.
Jake and Ben, Cole's visit on the show is brought to you by Hercules First Federal Credit Union, growing stronger together. He does cover the Mammoth for KSLSports.com. He's our friend Cole Bagley. What's going on, Cole?
How we doing, boys?
Doing well. Hey, Cole, can you diagnose, I guess, the health? And I don't mean actual health, the injury report. I mean, the team, they clinch a playoff berth, and then they've lost back-to-back games. Where are they in this playoff race, and are they still in an advantageous spot?
Yeah, I had some good conversations today with a couple of the veterans on the team, and I just straight up asked them. I said, you know, you guys win 5 in a row, you clinch a spot, and then you struggle the last 2 games. You know, how does that kind of happen? And, you know, kind of the overall theme and message was, look, you know, they're not making excuses, but it's like it's human nature, right? Like they win 5 straight, they're at the top of their game, but they exhausted themselves to do that. And then, you know, going into those next 2 after, you know, the job was technically done, they're towing the line, right? They're seeing, you know, hey, can I get away with this? Can I get away with that? Not quite at the top of their game, and you know, you do that too often in the National Hockey League, and you know, it's just so competitive, and there's so many good teams, and even at the end of the year, you know, if you look at a lot of the teams historically who, you know, are at the bottom of the league at the tail end of the season, and they have nothing to play for, well, they can rack up wins. You know, they can beat some of the top teams. I mean, Arizona did that year after year during, you know, the early stages of the rebuild, where, you know, they're out in February, March, you know, what have you, and then, you know, a team like Colorado or Edmonton comes to town and they ended up beating them because, you know, those teams had kind of exhausted themselves and were trying to kind of self-preserve. And so for Utah, you know, I don't think it's anything to worry about. You know, they're still in full control of their destiny. They can actually clinch the top wildcard spot tonight. They do need a little bit of help from some of the other teams, but they're still in full control. They're very confident, and you know, they're excited about what's ahead over these next couple weeks.
We've asked you something similar, but in the past. But how important is it for them to avoid the Avalanche in the first round?
Yeah, it's super important. You know, I think there's 2 teams that Utah really should do everything in their power to avoid, and you know, the second one's kind of out of their control. But you know, you do not want to face Colorado or Edmonton in the first round of the playoffs. You know, Colorado set some regular season records this season. You know, they're a juggernaut. They're definitely the best team in the National Hockey League. They're on pace to win the President's Trophy. It's just every single line is dangerous and can hurt you at any moment. You know, with the likes of, you know, McKinnon and Makar and Landeskog and Nichus, and, you know, they added Nazem Kadri, you know, at the deadline. That's a really good team, and that's a team that should win the Stanley Cup. Not saying that they will, but that's a team that, you know, on paper, when you look at it, that's the team that should be hoisting Lord Stanley here in a couple months. So yeah, I do like the way that Utah matches up against Colorado, but you know, if you were to look at their potential matchups, you know, if they're able to draw Vegas or if they were able to draw Anaheim, those are series that they can win. Not to say that it's a guarantee or anything, but they can beat those teams. Whereas if they draw Colorado, I think at best Utah would win 2 games, and I'd probably say the same about Edmonton. You know, I'm never going to bet against Connor McDavid in the first round of the playoffs, and you know, same can be said about Nathan McKinnon. You know, just the way that those 2 are the best players in the world, and they just take their games to another level come playoff time.
Well, Vegas has played 81 games. Edmonton's played 81 games. They have 1 game left each. So Vegas Vegas is up 2 points. They just need 1 point, so get to overtime, and they clinch that top spot in the Pacific.
Yes, as long as Vegas just needs a single point, and they would clinch the top spot in the Pacific, which, again, that would be, you know, Utah would – best case scenario would be Anaheim, but I would put Vegas second on that list.
So looking at the Mammoth then and what they've got left in their next couple of games, is Winnipeg playing for anything? Are any of these teams that they've got down the stretch still playing for anything?
No. You know, the playoffs are set. All 16 teams that are going to compete for the Stanley Cup are in. You know, the rest of the teams that still had a chance were all eliminated last night. So, you know, if there's anything to play for, it's pride. Or, you know, there are some scenarios where teams are calling up some of their younger players, some of their prospects, and guys are vying for, new contracts or opportunities next season. And, that's what you got out of Calgary the other night. Their team, that they had nothing to play for, but they had nothing to lose. And so, teams are still going to be competitive. There's no nights off. Even when a team's eliminated, they're still going to give you their best. And, we'll see who ends up in net tonight for Winnipeg. I believe they're on the second half of a back-to-back, so I'd be surprised if we saw Connor Hellebuck. But, it's still going to be a tough game, and, Utah needs to reassert themselves and get back to their winning ways. Finish strong, right? They at this point, they can control their destiny. And, I think, even more importantly, they need to be in a groove stepping into that first round because, regardless of who they go up against, it's going to be a tall bill. And, if they want to make some noise and if they want to get to that second round, they're going to need to be at their best.
I think a lot of us are looking forward to our first NHL playoff experience here in town. So, Cole, if you would, describe how the gameplay changes in the playoffs, and also, if you would, how the Mammoth are equipped to deal with that change.
Yeah, I mean, everything is tenfold. It's 10 times faster. It's 10 times more physical. It's, every hit means more. Every goal is more deflating for the team that allows it. Mistakes are maximized. I mean, one mistake can lose you a series, and that's, as I've been, the last couple of days, I've just kind of taken the opportunity to talk with a lot of the veterans about how does the game change? Because, it's interesting because Ian Cole, who's, I think, got the most playoff experience in the room. He's won multiple Stanley Cups. He went to 14 straight playoff appearances. Last year was the first year he had missed in almost 2 decades, right? He said, look, it's the same game, but it's not. It's a little bit, it's obviously faster and everything that I described. And so I think for Utah, it's about just playing their game. I mean, recognizing that, hey, it's going to be more physical, so we've got to up the physicality. It's going to be faster, so we've got to up the speed, but not to the point of trying to be someone that they aren't. That was kind of the message from Nate Schmidt, who I was able to talk with today was, you need to up your game. You need to be better. You need to be more aware and play faster and better. But at the same time, just keep your identity. And I think for Utah, they're arguably one of the most dangerous opponents for any of these top seeds that doesn't feel like anybody's really talking about them. They've beaten some really good teams this year, and I think it's because their game is kind of set up to do so. I mean, if you don't bring your A game against the Mammoth, they're designed to take you off guard and to bury you. With their speed, they can fly past anybody. They can drown defenses. They can break them down. And when Utah is at their best, and we've talked about this before, is when they combine their speed and their finesse with physicality, when they're strong on the forecheck, when they're pinning teams in the defensive zone, and they're able to then create turnovers, reload, and then utilize their speed and finesse to break down defenses before they can even blink, that's when Utah is at their best. And so, we'll see. There's a lot of additional factors. There's obviously the mental factor, the maturity factor. I think that is what's going to ultimately determine Utah's success is, can they go into this and remain focused and maintain their identity while still raising their game to the next level. If so, I think there's a good chance that Utah could upset whoever they end up playing.
Do rotations shorten? Do we ever see the backup goaltender in a playoff game?
I'd be surprised if we saw much of Vanacek at all. It's tough. I think he's a good goaltender. I think he's got a very unique style, but it just hasn't been a good fit. The trust level obviously isn't there. I mean, he's just played so few games. He never got into a rhythm, and he's lost the majority of the games he's played. Now that's not all his fault. He obviously drew some difficult scheduling situations and a lot of back halves of back-to-backs and games where Utah kind of took the night off and let him out to dry. But yeah, I wouldn't anticipate that we'll see much of him, if at all. I would expect that we will see Vejmelka from here on out. We'll see how tonight's result goes. If they can clinch the top wild card spot, then maybe they give him the final game off and let Vanacek finish it out. But in the playoffs, I would expect to see Vejmelka. And then I think we'll see how Utah plays it. There's definitely times where shifts are a little bit shorter. They're a little bit faster just to keep guys fresh. We'll see how Utah kind of approaches things because there's a lot of youth on this team. There's a lot of young guys that haven't been there before, and maybe it would be good to kind of get them off the ice a little bit faster and shorten shifts. But that's obviously up to the coach's discretion to decide if they want to use that approach or not.
How critical is the coach? How much can the coach really impact a series?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think adjustments are going to be a big deal. It's obviously the players have to play, but I think where the coach can have the greatest impact is, how can he inspire his guys? Coaching has obviously a huge impact in certain circumstances. I mean, there's been years where a coach has been fired, at the deadline or, earlier in the season, and a new guy comes in and they win the Stanley Cup. I mean, that happened for the Pittsburgh Penguins in 2016. They fired their head coach, I believe, in January. Mike Sullivan came in and he won them two straight Stanley Cups. And so a lot of it can be about, their inspirations and then as well adjustments. How, if a certain lineup isn't working, how is the coach going to make the changes? Is he going to make the right changes? What about the power play? If the power play isn't clicking, through the first two games in a series, does they need to make a change? So for a coach, I think it comes down to, inspiration and then proper adjustments if need be.
I don't know if you saw it last night. I don't know if it's just people talking on a podcast, but there was some conversation about Austin Matthews maybe being done in Toronto, and potentially Utah being the top option for the trade pieces go. I'm not talking about that specifically, but what does making the playoffs this year mean for the offseason and kind of the trajectory of this team? Is it time to now go all in? Do you stick with this roster and say, okay, now they're just starting to kind of figure themselves out? How do you think making the postseason has changed that perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for Utah, the way that they've found success, the way that they've emerged from the rebuild has been, by being patient. Not jumping, not trying to jump ahead of themselves, not trying to go all in on one particular player. And a lot of that is, just because of how hockey is. I think, the NBA and the NHL differ in a lot of ways. Hockey is just more of a team sport. Sure, there's definitely scenarios and there's times in the past where one player has made the difference. But for Utah and Bill Armstrong, I think the mentality is just to stick to the game plan, is to stick to the way that they've been building so far, because it's worked. I mean, yeah, they've made fairly big acquisitions, right? Like they traded for Sergachev, they traded for JJ Peterka, but it wasn't these massive swings where you go all in. And for Utah, I don't think that they've reached that point yet. Look at Colorado, for example. I mean, they not that they went all in, on Nazem Kadri, but they gave up some of their future to go and get a guy that they feel is going to put them over the top and help them win. Same thing with the Minnesota Wild. They gave up the majority of their future to go and get a guy like Quinn Hughes. I don't think that Utah is at that point yet. This is their first year in the playoffs. Let's see, how they can perform. Do they have the maturity to go in and win a series? Do they have the ability to raise their game? What do they need, after this year? I think this first round is going to be very telling about that. And, it's funny. I feel like every time there's a free agent or there's a player that's potentially going to be traded, they link it to Utah, but there's rarely ever been anything to those rumors. And I think a lot of the reason is it's more of, it could make sense because Utah has the assets, right? I mean, if Utah wanted to go get Austin Matthews this summer, they could totally do it. But in my mind, it just wouldn't be worth it because, Toronto is probably going to be asking for 3 top prospects and a handful of picks. I mean, do you really want to give up everything you've built over the last 5 years to speed up the rebuild process and open up your championship window? In my mind, Utah's just not, they're not quite there yet. Maybe 2-3 years down the road when they've got some playoff experience and, these Logan Cooley and Dylan Gunther have asserted themselves as superstars in the league, that to me is a point where, Utah could potentially, rationalize giving up some of their future to go all in. But for now, I think they're just going to continue to stick to the process and trust that process and just see where things go from here.
Thanks, Cole. Enjoy the game tonight.
Great stuff, Cole.
Thanks, guys.
Cole Bagley covers the Mammoth for KSLSports.com.